UFOs, alien encounters, and the spiritual element involved, and indeed the demonic component of a lot of this stuff. That's what I wanted to touch on in this video. I think it's beginning to become almost mainstream to discuss the potential uh, non-viability, both of the standard explanation or explanations regarding the UFO phenomenon and the standard alternative conspiracy theory explanation, that they're actually from another planet and that they're visiting for various reasons. Both of those are beginning to sort of chafe a little bit, and you're getting folks talking about how there might be something else going on, and how the, again, it's there's a spiritual element to this.
In fact, I had one. I remember the conversation very well. Um, this is a person I respected tremendously, very, very senior person. He's told me, he said, "Lou, I want you to stop doing this." I said, "Okay, sir, I certainly can, but may I ask why?" And he says, "Well, we already know what it is." Now, at that moment, I honestly thought maybe it was our own technology. I was running up against some super uber secret sap, and they were telling me to stop. And I said, "Okay, sir, so it's ours." And he said, "No, that's not what I'm saying." And he said, he asked me point blank, "Have you read your Bible lately?" And I wasn't quite sure where he was going with that. And I said, "Well, sir, I think I know what it says. Where are you going with this?" And he said, "Well, then you would know that these things are demonic and we should not be pursuing them."
UFO story. But if you talk to people who, have actual knowledge of it that they gathered themselves, there are parts of that story that I do not understand at all that are really, really, really dark. But there's some stuff there that's just like, man, I'm not even sure what that means. There's a spiritual component there that I don't fully understand.
My own view is that these are not aliens. I think they've been here forever.
But they're not aliens. They're from here.
You say you've seen UFOs. Is it you believe in aliens or no? They're not aliens.
Do you believe in angels and demons?
The topic is pretty sinister, kind of dark, so I've tried to just give a take without maybe opening the door to fascination or to fear, actually, because since humans have the ability to pray and have spiritual authority, in theological terms, their proper place is not to be subjected to negative influences. They have the ability to banish those influences, but I'll get into that again in the conclusion. And there's reports of prayer ending these kinds of experiences by people who claim to have had them. As I understand it, the case for UFOs and alien encounters being a spiritual phenomenon, which is to say, not being from another planet and responding not so much to advanced technology as to a subtle form of physicality, what folklore referred to as fairy phenomenon, or in Arabic, the jinn, that kind of thing, begins by noting that UFO sightings are often connected to encounters with beings, and that those beings often behave in ways that are consistent with religious and folkloric accounts of spirits, and not terribly consistent with what we would expect from an advanced alien race. Furthermore, that their behavior is, and the experiences themselves are often absurd in content and even hypnotic in intent. And we can get into why or how some researchers have arrived at that conclusion. Specifically, their interests and behavior can appear sinister. The experience itself appears to be accessible by way of altered states of consciousness, including ingesting mind-altering substances. It's not at all immediately apparent why advanced creatures from another world would make themselves available to or be perceptible by way of the consumption of psychedelic drugs. And finally, although the behavior of the actual UFO in UFO sightings could be consistent with advanced technology, it's also consistent with being a sort of subtle spiritual phenomenon that's projecting on rather than actually interacting with our plane of physicality, so to speak.
In terms of multidimensionality, that kind of thing, the framework that I'm familiar with, for example, is something called the holographic principle. It derives itself from general relativity and quantum mechanics, and that is, if you want to imagine a 3D object such as yourself casting a shadow onto a 2D surface, that's the holographic principle. So you can be projected, quasi-projected from higher dimensional space to lower dimensional. It's a scientific trope that you can actually cross, literally, as far as I understand, but there's probably guys with PhDs that we could probably argue about that.
But you have not seen any documentation that that's what's occurring?
Only a theoretical framework discussion.
And in general, the phenomena of the alien encounter is consistent with elements that folklore will highlight with respect to fairies. The fact that they are shapeshifters and often present themselves as animals comes up a lot. The idea that they are invocable, and now you have people claiming that through meditation and so forth, they can invoke UFOs. Spirits are thought to be eminently invocable. They respond to humans calling them. And then more sinisterly, and in terms of the demonic aspect to all this, the idea that they're interested in children, in kidnapping children, in replacing children, which would be an illusion to try to alienate parent from child, and that they are erotically fixated on humans at times and want to observe humans in the act, join with humans, and even produce hybrids. This is very common in fairy folklore. It's actually also in scripture in a certain sense, and it's very common. It defines the UFO abduction experience, the content of the experience, quite consistently. So there's a great deal of correspondence there.
In an altered state of consciousness, there's a remarkable unanimity and uniformity and similarity amongst these three supposedly different categories of beings: spirits, fairies, and so-called aliens today. I really went into this in some depth in my research, and I found that there are really astonishing similarities amongst these three categories of beings. Very commonly, shamans, just as we saw from the painted caves, will encounter a spirit being in a therianthropic form, part animal and part human. I was astonished to discover that fairies in medieval Europe were also very frequently encountered in that form. And I have a woodcut from Holland in the 15th century on my desk, which shows a group of fairies dancing in a ring. And if you look closely at them, you see that they are therianthropes, that they have horns and hooves, that they're part animal and part human. And again, in the modern phenomenon of alien abductions, and we have massive documentation on this as a result of John Mack's work, for example. Very frequently, the abductee will first see a being who is an animal, or part animal and part human in form, later perhaps transforms into the more familiar grey type of entity. So there's that common motif running through all three of these experiences. What were fairies best known for and feared for in medieval Europe? It was abducting human beings. What are aliens today best known and feared for? Abductions. What happens with shamans? Very frequently they experience an abduction into the spirit world. It's their first encounter. What about the issue of interbreeding with supernatural beings? I know the cases of shamans who have a sexual partner in the spirit world, a wife, even children in the spirit world. Fairies were constantly amorous towards human beings and would have sexual encounters, and babies would be created. And again, this is a standard motif of modern alien abductions. So one can go through these astonishing similarities in enormous depth, and the conclusion that I came to is that all of these are essentially the same experience, just being viewed through slightly different cultural spectacles.
And it's also worth noting that St. Paul does refer to demons as powers of the air in Ephesians, and in Orthodox Christian tradition, demons are often thought to inhabit the air between the moon, the sublunary sphere below the moon, and the earth. So the idea that they would be up there in the air is actually quite traditional. With respect to the absurdity of the phenomena, ufologist Jacques Vallée, in his various works, has noted, among other elements, is the idea that a lot of the encounters appear to be engineered scenes, he says. So we would say staged. They appear staged. People will encounter a UFO in the middle of the road, and it seems like the denizens were repairing the craft. So they decided to land right in the middle of a road and to stop there for repairs, presumably knowing full well that somebody would come upon them. So let's get into this idea of absurdity and what the absurdity might mean or what it might lead to. In the 80s and 90s, there was a magician, an illusionist called Uri Geller, who was quite famous. And at one point, he claimed that his magical abilities were given to him by certain beings able to manipulate the physical plane, that these beings were from another planet. And he discusses in an interview how they will often do absurd things. And he wonders whether they are a civilization of clowns, so typical poltergeist behavior, which would indicate that the beings, whether they told him they were from another planet or not, would be what tradition would refer to as fairies, spirits, poltergeists, etc., rather than actual advanced, technologically sophisticated uh, creatures from another world. But anyway, he does at one point conclude that the reason why they act in absurd ways is because we ourselves are absurd. So he justifies what's being done to him, the absurdity being foisted on him, in a way that sort of exculpates the being and puts the onus on humans for themselves being absurd. And I think that that has a subtle potential for anti-human, um, self-deceiving thinking, which can lead in a very negative direction. And that's something that Jacques Vallée gets into a great deal when he talks about the absurdity of the experiences that he was able to document, and he comes to conclusions about what the psychological effect of that absurdity can be. Quote, the most clear result was that the phenomenon behaved like a conditioning process. The logic of conditioning uses absurdity or confusion to achieve its goal while hiding its mechanism. There's a similar structure in the UFO stories. I came to the knowledge that they understood this rule. The way to a man's belief is through confusion and absurdity. And getting into more detail with that idea, drawing on what Charles Upton has to say in Cracks in the Great Wall, we could say that alienation from normality, from your family, from conventional morality, from society at large, from the beliefs of most people, from the things you share with others, can be achieved through powerful abnormal experiences, a powerful traumatic abnormal experience that really puts you outside or makes you feel like you're outside of the circle of commonly held beliefs and feelings concerning all those around you, will isolate you. It will make you feel alienated. Actually, abuse often consists in traumatizing a person and separating a person from the their social circle, their family, and so on. And there's also the element of deferred closure or subliminal contradiction. An absurd experience will make a person lose faith in their own mind, in their own reason, and their own capacity to make sense of the world, and make them dependent on the source of those contradictions, the source of that absurdity, for some kind of closure, some kind of closing the circle, some kind of data that finally puts the many doubts to rest. And also, however, it can lead to an addiction to complexity, and you find this in a lot of circles, New Age, but also religious, but also academic. People get addicted to constantly new strange data that will keep their mind churning. That can be very, very addictive and very damaging as well. Now, the manipulative element that Jacques Vallée talks about is discussed as a means for creating a new religious ethos, a new religious mythology by guys like Seraphim Rose, who was an American convert to Orthodox Christianity, who wrote Orthodoxy and the Religion of the Future, and by Carl Jung, in a sense, when he talks about UFOs in his book, A Modern Mythology of Things Seen in the Sky. And that also there's a religious component to it. So I think it's worth getting into what the characteristics of that kind of religion, that kind of religiosity, that kind of mythology are. And the most prominent would be that the alien is an intermediary, as Charles Upton in Cracks in the Great Wall talks about. One of the conclusions that abductees will often walk away with is that the alien is an intermediary between them and some higher impersonal form of consciousness. In traditional terms, most religions agree that there is a kind of being whose job it is to relay messages to human beings, and that's basically an angel by whatever name, and then that there are other kinds of beings, spirits, jinn, whatever, who are not tasked with that. And so it isn't correct for us to treat them as, so to speak, high priests, sources of religious knowledge, etc., in addition to which they are not above us on the great chain of being. So even leaving the issue of the wrongness of worshiping beings other than God aside, even as non-worshipped intermediaries, this would not be appropriate. This would not be an appropriate relationship. It's also interesting that the Quran specifically at one point has a jinn, a spirit, talking to humans and telling humans that they don't have access to higher knowledge and they can't tell the future. It says at one point that they would perch sort of at the top of the sky and try to get information from beyond, but that they're not allowed to do that. And so they don't have extra information and they don't know what's coming. They don't know the future. And so that presumably people who claim that they have extra knowledge by way of spirits, by way of contact with spirits, are actually not getting any particular knowledge from them, that they don't have a privileged access to knowledge and to the future compared to humans. So that's an important, interesting element. Another issue that comes up a lot is that of abduction and the violence, the compulsion involved in it as a sort of ego death, where it's actually a parody of true initiation or true transcendence of the ego. As Upton writes, God is not a hypnotist or a terrorist. A deep and fertile relationship with the source of all life cannot be the product of brainwashing and mind control. Whatever forces employ such techniques are opposed to God. And then he quotes C.S. Lewis in the Screwtape Letters to the effect that demons basically see us as food and want to expand their selfhood at the expense of ours. Obviously, there's the messianic apocalyptic expectation, what Eric Voegelin would call immanentizing the eschaton, the idea that the spiritual realization of humanity will happen physically and by way of something tangible like technology, which is going to redeem us and be spiritually fulfilling. So technology, right, comes to replace spiritual development in a certain sense, and psychological absurdity and technical complexity and thinking about these elaborate accounts of what these beings are and what they bring comes to replace the simplicity of devotion to God. It's kind of like a parody of religious mysteries. And finally, you've got the idea of biological hybridity, the idea that we are hybrid creatures or that we are creating hybrid creatures with the aliens, which is a kind of parody, in a sense, of the God-human relationship in Scripture, the language of adoption, of sonship, of being made in the image or likeness of God, or of being a divinely ordained vice regent of God placed on the earth. And again, this relates to the concept of alienation from normality, as well as to the theory that all life has been seeded from elsewhere, which serves as a kind of intellectual distraction or postponing this panspermia notion, right? Where did life come from? Well, it came from another planet. It just postpones a deeper philosophical question of the origin of consciousness and why consciousness is not reducible to matter. It's kind of like a distraction from actually grappling with the spiritual mystery of the human condition and of consciousness as such. Writes Upton about this. Quote, the experience of human alien dual identity is multiple personality disorder on the psychic plane and demonic possession on the spiritual one. As the vampires of folklore turn their victims into vampires, so the alien kidnappers turn their victims into aliens by stealing their souls, by destroying their identification with their own humanity. So that's Upton's take on this issue.
I like the person that makes me laugh more than anybody is when I'm fucking on psychedelics, and whatever that spirit is that's talking is always like has the jokes. It has the jokes. And the last time, so this is a reoccurring topic. And once again, I gotta say, this is not like, this is just something I see in my vision quest, right? So I asked the alien last time, I go, are you real? Are aliens real? He goes, you know what we look like, right? I'm like, well, yeah, the big eyes, almond eyes like this, bluish gray, no dick, big head, like, you know, like you've all seen that picture. It's like, you know what I look like? And he goes, we came down to Africa and we f***ed a human, right?
This is what
it's showing me. It's
okay,
like,
but it's not saying we f***ed a human.
oh no,
right?
it has the filthiest mouth.
Really?
Like I'm dying. Like I'm on the this is what I look like. I'm like in like nature, like with a shaman, and I'm
really?
Yeah, I'm like dying, and the thing is like just because everyone's like, oh, I'm gonna have a spiritual experience, like, and it is spiritual, but it's a long trip, and I don't have a because we don't with genitals. We use our mind. That's how we have sex, and so we're beyond that. And he goes, look in the mirror, bitch. And I go, what? You ever wonder why Koreans have such big heads and your eyes are a little bit like this and your are a little bit smaller? And I was like, you know, I'm drooling. I'm like, like, and look, I did a horrible job. His delivery is way more vulgar. It sounds more like Eddie Murphy in his prime. He's like cussing, and I'm like, I don't know. It's like in my mind, I'm like, this is not what I was expecting out of this spiritual journey.
The issue of hybridity does come up in scripture. Genesis 6:4 talks about it. The apocryphal First Enoch 7, chapter 7, talks about it. And what you have in the book of Enoch is these spiritual entities teaching magic to women in return for copulating with them and then producing very violent offspring who end up practicing blood drinking and cannibalism and such. In the Quran as well, you have two angels who would teach magic, but always with the warning that you shouldn't actually go down this road. This is a test. But those who disregarded the warning were demons who took that magic and then used it to separate men from women, to alienate wives and husbands. So there's not a direct joining of spiritual entity with human, but what there is demons using angelic magic for corrupting ends, sharing that magic with humans and messing up the man-woman relationship, possibly through possession or whatever else, possibly lusting after human women. As St. Augustine notes, a spirit can't physically breed with a human, can't actually happen in the literal sense. So perhaps it's going on as a kind of ritualization of possession and of consecration of the resulting child to these spirits which were taken to be gods. In addition to which, that would make sense of the theme in some mythologies that certain heroes, certain personages, are said to be 2/3 God and 1/3 human. So thirds instead of quarters. Why? Because the mother or the father might be human, and then there's a third that comes from the king or queen who's taken to be divine, And then the third is the possessing agency, the God to which this child is consecrated, which is also a parent. So the child effectively has three parents, which explains that theme, for example, in Mesopotamian texts of having thirds in ancestry, distinguishing divine from human ancestry. Now, I'm not saying all stories about demigods are somehow sinister. I'm actually very pro antique pagan hero. A lot of the claims to divine parenthood would have been figurative ways of emphasizing excellence, like such and such is a great warrior, he's the son of the god of war. Such and such is a great poet, he's the son of the god of poetry. The Neoplatonic writer Iamblichus actually makes this point that gods don't literally interbreed with humans, and stories about that are just vulgar ways of saying somebody was endowed with some high spiritual status. In the case of Hercules, for example, that seems to be the Stoic view. We have authors like Lucius Annaeus Cornutus from the 1st century AD and the 2nd century AD Epictetus, who say that no god bred with a human female to produce Hercules. That was just a mythologized account that came later. And in fact, there's a lot of pre-Christian Jewish authors who have a very positive view of Hercules, like Philo of Alexandria and Cleodemus Malchus, who even says Hercules was an ally of Abraham, and among his wives were 2 granddaughters of Abraham. And in this context, he would actually have fought against the giants, who Abraham's descendants also were involved in fighting against, Joshua and David and so on later on, which would explain why in Maccabees in the Bible, Judah Maccabee seems to view the Dorian Greeks, like the Spartans, the legacy of Hercules, as good pagans. Same with the Romans, actually, as opposed to the bad pagans that he's fighting. So, as I say, earlier rites in which a person was said to be possessed by a god or spirit during the conception of a child, and then the child was consecrated to that god, may be the original sort of context or inspiration for these mythological themes of gods and men interbreeding. And there's other phenomena there as well that they could be talking about. Anyway, back to aliens. And this focus on sexuality, this focus on breeding, this focus on alienating men and women and parents from children, which I believe Valet, but definitely Upton, notes is a consequence of the abduction experience very often, has a lot to do with the end point of a quote-unquote ufologist or alien-focused religiosity or mythology. Like any religion, it has to have some kind of direction that it thinks humans should go in and some kind of account for how it all ends, the apocalypse and so forth. And it tends to be about humans not being human anymore, not reproducing the way we've reproduced traditionally. It relates to that kind of technocratic idea of ever increasing the circle of artificiality and ever decreasing our rapport with our own biology and our own inherent psychology. We can sort of refer to how many abductees are told that the world is going to end in environmental devastation because of humans, and there's something perhaps as a consequence of that. The conclusion is that, there's something wrong with humans breeding and so forth, as well as the idea that came up in certain ufology cults, Heaven's Gate, prominently, of castration, of ending the human condition and transcending the human condition by way of castration.
What I was saying is, do you think we all end the same skin color and in some sort of a transsexual type of situation?
I think it's very possible that we all become genderless. Yes, I do think that's possible. Yeah. I think that might be what is happening with like microplastics or changing people's hormone systems. I don't know if you know about all that. Do you know about all that?
You know I don't know about it. I mean, I appreciate it, though.
There's a book called
Thank you.
Countdown.
That was nice of you.
By a woman. Her name is Dr. Shanna Swan. And she came on the podcast and she explained that there's certain chemicals that are in plastics and in some fertilizers that are disrupting the human body endocrine system. And it's causing people's penises to shrink, balls to shrink, sperm counts are lowering. If you think about that, like that is like causing gender to just kind of compress and to become like more ambiguous. And in the future, if that continues to happen, what does that mean? Like, what do we become genderless? And then what do we do to try to keep the human race alive? Well, we may revert to genetic engineering, like some sort of a medical technological intervention, so we breed from like splicing genes.
So we get enough males and we get enough females.
Yeah, and that has always been what's crazy about this is, although this sounds nuts, we're talking about it now, for decades, people that have been abducted by aliens have always said that aliens are performing experiments and making hybrids with human beings because their genetic material has run stale, because they're breeding, or they're rather reproducing through genetic manipulation rather than through sex, because they don't have sexual intercourse anymore.
So they need our eggs and sperm.
They need all that stuff. They need our material, but because they don't have that anymore. So that might be where all biological creatures that develop technology, and technology in our case involves a lot of plastic. The more technology, the more plastic in the bodies, the more the bodies become genderless.
Wow.
Wild.
So to wrap up, the UFO and alien encounter experience is consistent with traditional demonology and folklore, specifically with respect to how the demonic is interested in alienating the genders, family, sexuality, children, etc. It contains an anti-human ethos, where there's this false transcendence. You transcend by losing basic human structures like gender and reproduction, the idea that humans are bad for the world. And that overlaps a lot with the technocratic, modern, technology-focused idea that human biology and psychology are a problem going forward, that the things that differentiate us, be it as people from each other or as genders, are actually an impediment to a more rational way of living. Of course, there's an ambiguity in this phenomenon. The Muslims believe in a good jinn. Christians do too. We have stories of Saint Anthony meeting a satyr, a faun spirit, who was actually Christian or wanted to be Christian, wanted to know about the new religion, and came representing his tribe to the saint to have the tribe of these satyr creatures that were living in the deserts outside Alexandria in Egypt join the new religion, the new Christian religion. That's interesting. That's in the life of the saint, of Saint Anthony. So it's worth bearing that in mind. Not all of these kinds of entities are evil in the traditions that believe in such entities. And of course, you have even flying machines. In Indian tradition, you have the tradition of flying machines, the so-called vimanas, but many of those are manned by righteous, godly creatures, not by demons. But that doesn't mean that it's ever a good idea to interact with spirits, because the experience is too powerful and it's not easy to psychologically integrate. It even has a physical impact. It's just not for us, and it shouldn't be pursued. I know that this subject can exert this kind of unhealthy fascination. It's got the capacity to sort of grab people, and I know folks that get really into it, and there's kind of this morbid curiosity, and I don't want to contribute to that, but I think it's important to engage in, to the degree that you have a particular take and you think that it's helpful to people or can be helpful to people. But in any case, because it's an eminently spiritual phenomenon, anything sinister in it, we as humans, according to multiple traditions, have the capacity, the agency, in theological terms, the authority to banish that and to be free of that sinister element. And because it's, again, a spiritual phenomenon, prayer, which has efficacy in all areas, has particularly immediate efficacy in this area. So I don't want to open the door to fear either, because I don't think that that's caution, certainly, but fear shouldn't necessarily be a part of the equation there, because human beings have prayer on our side. When it comes to the sinister spiritual, we have the ability to banish it and to be free of it by calling on God. So, okay, I do hope that was helpful. Thank you very much for watching, and until next time.